Why? It is a fair question. For those paying close attention to metal movements in the Middle East, the fact that an air campaign against Iran is happening might not come as a surprise. But recognizing that something might happen and explaining why it is happening are two entirely different questions. And in the absence of a clear articulation from the Trump administration, it is understandable that a common public refrain is that Operation Epic Fury is actually Operation Epstein Fury. So today we are going to take some classic lines on maps and shift them to a new theater, because the nuance of what is happening in Iran tells us something critical about how the world works more generally. I want to start by laying down the parameters of what I am trying to do here. I cannot adjudicate what is happening with the White House's internal political monologue. As a result, I am not going to discuss the Epstein thing much further. If you want the deeper details there, I have previously discussed this in the context of Venezuela, and the logic applies to Iran just as well. Rather, what I want to do is lay out the Pentagon's rationale for the war, combined with some of my own mathematical adjudication of what is logically valid and what does not make any sense. Now, why am I doing this? I should not be, because I am not a spokesperson for the White House. And remember, my job here is to describe what is happening and not offer partisan political perspectives. But we have seen both the President and the Secretary of Defense flail around whenever they try to provide a rationale. They tend to use a shotgun approach rather than form a coherent narrative, often conflating the substantive disagreements at play with the strategic problems accounting for the timing of the war's onset. With the caveat that being good at explaining things is a separate skill from making good decisions, neither Trump nor Hegseth is particularly good at explaining the nuances of defense policy, so there is a good question why they have taken the lead there. By contrast, Marco Rubio is very good at explaining the logic of U.S. policy. Think, for example, about the differences between his Munich Security Conference speech this year versus J.D. Vance's from last year. Meanwhile, this is video from his testimony on Venezuela, where he faced a lot of skeptical questions from Democrats. There were still plenty of disagreements by the end of the hearing, but no one could make a case that the policy was completely incoherent. And really, that is the first step of any good policy debate. Understand the logical argument being made, examine its logical validity, and then check whether its underlying assumptions are factually true. I suppose that it is telling that Rubio had the task of briefing Congress on the first day back at work, as the Trump administration needs some level of legislative compliance to continue the war, though even he flubbed a sentence in trying to argue that Israel was going to attack Iran one way or another, and so it was better for the United States to proactively join, rather than wait and see if Iran would strike U.S. assets in response. For the broader public, there was another missed opportunity at the State of the Union, where a clear 500 pre-written words would have done wonders, but we did not get that either. This has created a perfect storm for commentators to say that the administration has no real strategy for the Iran war, again pushing the conversation back to Jeffrey Epstein. To wit, first-day polling showed 27% support for the war compared to 43% against. Not exactly the rally-round-the-flag effect you would hope for on day one of a new war. Then again, remember how Bill Clinton was testifying right before the strikes began? If you don't, that may be the point. Disapproval may still be worth a distraction, and you can see why the public consensus drifts in that direction. But as I often offer as a reminder on this channel, national security policy comes from the ground up in the United States, meaning that bureaucrats over in the Pentagon are largely responsible for the planning and execution of the war. As competent career government employees, the vast majority of whom work across administrations, they do have a clear sense of what is happening overseas. That gets pushed up to the White House, which then has to decide what policy to execute. From there, you could choose to fight a war for the reasons that the Pentagon prescribed. You could start a war for whatever other reason you feel like, or you could just do nothing. Today, my role is to explain and scrutinize the Pentagon's thinking. What you want to do from there is your choice. At least you will make better informed decisions afterward. As a basic starting point, the substantive matter at the heart of the conflict is political influence in the broader region. On the micro level, you could think about this exclusively as what Israel's borders look like, or whether Iraq becomes a puppet state of Iran's, or half a dozen other regional territorial questions. You could even discuss the domestic human rights situation in Iran as a point of substantive disagreement, though it is hard to tell how much the White House genuinely cares about that versus playing it up for US moderates or international audiences. The key point here is that these are things that the United States actually wins if it militarily succeeds in its endeavors. You could raise questions about how the United States might achieve those goals when it is only dropping bombs from the air, but let's defer most of those concerns for another video. What is critical to note for now is what does not fall under this category. The bulk of the administration's public appeals focus on Iran's nuclear program or its ballistic missile production. To further add to the confusion, those were the center points of the negotiations in Oman before the war. We will eventually get to the relevance of those programs. For now, though, note that nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles are means to an end. If you emerge victorious in a war, you do not win the other side's bombs. But the bombs do dictate whether you win or lose. Thus, they are the means to the end, not an end in and of themselves. Moving along, as longtime lines on maps enthusiasts know, such substantive disagreements do not explain why wars occur. Let's use Iran's territory to visually represent the amount of policy control that Tehran has in the region. Divisions further west represent greater control for Iran, while divisions further east represent less control for Tehran. After the war ends, there will ultimately be some type of political division. Let's use this white line to represent the expected outcome. Note for later that what dictates where the expected outcome falls is largely the types and quantities of weapons that you have at your disposal, which might determine whether you would be interested in building, say, a nuclear weapon. Now, as we have already observed, war is expensive for both parties in terms of both men and money. If we scale those costs in terms of how much Iran values policy influence, we can represent them as the space between the white line and this green line. Likewise, for the United States, we can represent the other set of costs as the space between the white line and this blue line. The critical implication is that any peaceful division of policy influence between the blue and green lines is mutually preferable to war. That is because each of those divisions is commensurate with the military outcome, but neither has to pay the costs associated with fighting. This logic only fails if a leader gains sufficient private benefits for war. And I swear this will be my last Epstein-related comment for the day, but those private benefits have to exceed both parties' costs of war to explain why bargaining fails. That is a lot to ask. You cannot simply note that there is an incentive to create a distraction and then call it a day. Anyway, the substantive policy dispute between Iran and the rest of the countries does not explain why the current war is happening. Rather, we must also articulate why the parties are choosing to fight, despite the existence of this range of mutually preferable settlements. This is usually where you will start to hear some discussion about Iran's various weapons programs. The basic idea is that, if left unconstrained, Iran will build more military power. Then, once in a stronger position, it will expand its policy influence in the region. And as we just explored, the other parties will not have much of a choice but to concede to those demands. The alternative is that Iran would find a war to be a better option, and the costs of fighting generate an even worse outcome for the rest of those countries. However, if the United States anticipates that all of this will happen later, it could intervene and launch a preventive war in the present. After all, fighting today when the balance of power is advantageous, even if it will come at a cost to you, may be better than whatever you could hope to extract out of a negotiated settlement with Iran in the future. This is why the Trump administration discusses Iran's nuclear program and ballistic missile production so much. Each of them contributes to an overall power shift. The idea is that Iran building ballistic missiles would make a future preventive war intolerably costly. Then Iran could take the final steps to produce nuclear weapons, which would further shift the balance of power in Iran's favor. Basically, this would replicate how North Korea built up so much artillery near the DMZ that launching a preventive war to stop Pyongyang from building a nuclear weapon became impractical. And thus, the Western coalition has been dealing with a nuclear North Korea for roughly 2 decades now. So, to condense this argument into a sentence, Iran building those weapons creates a bargaining problem in the future that the United States does not want to deal with, and that was one of the key motivations for Trump to pull the trigger. Well, that can explain the US policy position easily enough, but I do not believe that it gives us a good explanation for the war overall, because it washes away Iran's agency here. And apologies, but I really want to dig deep into this point. I have been illuminating crisis bargaining theory to the masses for more than 4 years now, but we are finally reaching the topic where my self-respecting academic alter ego made his main research contribution. The weapons that Iran wants to construct do not appear out of thin air. Rather, Iran has to make an active decision to spend money to invest in them. And I do mean invest here. The government spends money to obtain more coercive power, and then hopefully profits by extracting greater policy concessions from its rivals after the power shift has been completed. Framed that way, though, if a rival will destroy you or your weapons programs before the investment matures, then making the investment in the first place is silly. We already saw this logic in action about a decade ago with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action agreement that the Obama administration negotiated. In today's terms, the implication is that the preventive war logic might explain why the United States would want to intervene, conditional on Iran developing the weapons, but it does not explain why Iran tries to develop the weapons in the first place. Now, there are a couple of ways to resurrect the preventive war logic as a cause of war. The threat to intervene gets complicated if the United States cannot observe whether Iran is secretly building weapons or not. However, given that the United States had enough intelligence to know exactly where the Ayatollah was, despite an armada forming off of his coast, I am skeptical that there was much of an intel gap there. The other bargaining problem that can arise here is if Iran underestimates the United States' willingness to fight a preventive war. Put differently, the Ayatollah thinks that the United States is weak and will not intervene, so Iran tries to build a nuclear weapon despite the US threats. I think that is a plausible interpretation of what happened back in June of 2025. It is hard to claim that Tehran was still unsure of US intentions in February 2026, after having witnessed the United States exercise its willingness to bomb nuclear sites. So, is Iran building arms an important strategic incentive that Washington must worry about? Yes, absolutely. Is it a coherent explanation for the war? Not quite. That said, there is a way to square the timing of the war using the same sort of power shift mechanism that we focused on a moment ago. Remember, the key theoretical problem with nuclear weapons and such is that Iran makes an active choice to build them, and thus it chooses to initiate the power shift. But not all power shifts are like that. Some occur exogenously, to use a term of art from political science. If neither party can exert much control over the future distribution of power, then you cannot so easily sidestep the problem. Well, that is exactly the issue right now with the state of protests in Iran. The government is effectively fighting 2 battles at once right now: an air campaign against US and Israeli bombers, and an as of yet not fully formed civil resistance. You will remember that earlier in the year, mass protests were occurring all over the country in response to the government's inability to provide basic public services, ranging from electricity production to water distribution. The tricky thing about protest movements, though, is that they require coordination among citizens. Such coordination is fickle. Public expectations of protests may persist today, but there is no guarantee that they will continue 6 months from now. To draw the connection to earlier, The United States' chances in a war today are better than what they would look like later, and it is difficult for the parties to freeze the current set of expectations. Consequently, when Trump told protesters that help was on the way, and the modal internet response was that this was a classic taco situation in the making, I was a bit more cautious. There were still questions about whether the protesters would come back on the streets following a massive government crackdown, with tens of thousands reportedly killed. But in the days before the war, protesters were starting to come out again around the country. The Ayatollah could not credibly commit to accepting a more reduced role in the region's politics over the long run, and so Trump gave the go-ahead to begin Operation Epic Fury on February 28th. Wait around longer, and that opportunity might have vanished. Does this tell us whether the war will be a success for the United States? No. The fog of war extends to times even before the first shot is fired. We can only sit back and wait to see what happens next. But at least that is the logic of what is happening here. Meanwhile, you will have to wait to see what aspect of the war I will cover tomorrow. I am betting on the broader geopolitical gamble that the president is taking, but who knows what developments might happen in the interim. I suppose that you can watch this playlist on the greater conflict in the region to tide you over until then. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.